They pulled back from you and you didn't chase after them. You didn't send a second text when the first one went unanswered. You didn't dial their number just to hang up before it connected. You didn't send that raw emotional message you typed out at 2 in the morning, the one your thumb hovered over for a full minute before you finally closed the app instead. You simply went quiet. From the outside, it looked like almost nothing had happened. No dramatic confrontation, no final argument, no long explanation demanding to be understood, no desperate attempt to make them see your pain, just silence. To anyone else, it might have seemed like the easiest choice in the world. After all, what could be difficult about saying nothing? But anyone who has lived through a relationship marked by manipulation, emotional instability, or constant invalidation knows the truth. Sometimes silence is the hardest thing a person will ever choose, because silence is rarely empty. It is filled with every sentence you wanted to say, but knew would change nothing. Every apology you almost offered simply to restore temporary peace. Every explanation you rehearsed in your head, hoping that if you could just find the perfect combination of words, they would finally understand. Every memory that tempted you to believe things could still be different. Silence is not the absence of emotion. It is emotion held with intention instead of released through impulse. That distinction matters. Most people think self-control means not feeling anything. Real self-control is feeling everything while deciding that your emotions do not have to dictate your next action. You still miss them. You still wonder what they are thinking. You still replay conversations in your mind. You still question whether leaving was the right decision. Those feelings do not disappear overnight. What changes is what you do with them. Instead of chasing reassurance, you let uncertainty exist. Instead of demanding answers, you accept that some questions may never be fully resolved. Instead of seeking one last conversation to ease your discomfort, you begin learning how to comfort yourself. That is a profound psychological shift, because every time you resist the urge to reach out, you are teaching your nervous system something new. You are teaching it that discomfort is survivable, that loneliness does not have to become desperation, that anxiety does not require immediate action. At first, your mind will resist this lesson. It will whisper convincing arguments. Maybe they didn't understand. Maybe one more message would change everything. Maybe if I explain it differently. The mind is searching for certainty, but certainty is not always available. Sometimes the healthiest choice is not finding every answer. It is refusing to sacrifice your peace while searching for them. There is also another reason silence carries so much weight. When communication has become part of an unhealthy emotional cycle, every interaction reinforces the pattern. You explain, they dismiss, you defend yourself, they change the subject, you apologize, they regain control. The details vary, but the cycle remains surprisingly consistent. Breaking that cycle rarely begins with finding better words. It begins by refusing to repeat the pattern. Silence interrupts what repetition cannot heal. For many people, this feels unnatural. They were taught that healthy relationships require communication, and that is true. Healthy relationships do require honest communication. But communication only works when both people are willing to listen, reflect, and respond in good faith. When conversations become tools for manipulation, confusion, or control, saying more does not necessarily create more understanding. Sometimes it simply creates more opportunities for the cycle to continue. That is why silence can become an act of self-respect rather than avoidance. It says something without needing to say anything. It says, I no longer need to convince you of my reality. It says, I no longer need your agreement in order to trust my own experience. It says, I am choosing peace over endless arguments. Perhaps the hardest part comes afterward. The quiet evenings, the moments when your hand instinctively reaches for your phone, the urge to check whether they viewed your profile, the curiosity about whether they miss you. These moments test your resolve far more than dramatic confrontations ever could, because healing is often built through ordinary decisions repeated consistently. One evening you choose not to send the message. The next day, you resist checking their social media. The following week, you spend time with people who genuinely care about your well-being. These small decisions slowly reshape your emotional world. Months later, you may struggle to recognize the person who once believed they could not survive without one more conversation. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped believing your healing depended on another person's response. That realization changes everything. You begin noticing that your thoughts become quieter, your body feels less tense, you laugh more easily, you make plans without wondering how they will react, you rediscover parts of yourself that had gradually disappeared beneath constant emotional negotiation. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes peaceful, not because it erased the past, because it gave you room to build a future. Ironically, the greatest transformation often has very little to do with the other person. It has everything to do with you. You learn that strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength looks like closing the app instead of pressing send. Sometimes it looks like putting the phone down even when every emotion urges you to pick it back up. Sometimes it looks like allowing unanswered questions to remain unanswered because your peace matters more than temporary relief. In the end, your silence is not a punishment. It is not revenge. It is not a strategy to make someone chase you. It is the quiet moment when you stop asking another person to give you the closure, validation, or certainty that only you can begin creating within yourself. And while that choice may feel invisible to everyone else, it marks the beginning of one of the most important conversations you will ever have. The one where your actions finally start reflecting the respect, stability, and peace you have been trying to find all along. And something happened in that quiet that nobody ever prepared you for. The avoidant person on the other end panicked, not visibly, not in any way they would ever openly admit to, but something shifted internally, something cracked open that they had spent years, maybe their entire adult life, working to keep sealed shut. Because here's the thing you need to understand about avoidant people before we go any further into this. Their whole emotional structure rests on one core belief, that they don't actually need you, that they'll be perfectly fine without you, that if you were to leave, they'd feel relief instead of loss, and then you didn't beg, and the relief they were expecting never showed up. Carl Jung dedicated a large portion of his work to something he referred to as the shadow, those hidden parts of ourselves that get buried so deeply over time that we eventually forget they're even there. His view was that whatever we push down and refuse to look at doesn't just vanish, it keeps growing quietly in the dark. It waits. And at the moment we least expect it, usually right when our outer defenses start slipping, that buried material rises back up, demanding to finally be seen. Avoidant attachment carries its own version of this shadow. It's the part of them that actually craves connection more than anything. The part that was taught, usually way back in childhood, that needing someone is dangerous territory. That love comes wrapped in conditions that if they ever let a person truly see them, truly need someone, that person would eventually walk away, or worse, use that vulnerability as a weapon against them. So they learned early on to leave first, to build distance before distance could be forced on them, to pull back just enough that when you eventually left, as they always assumed you would, they could tell themselves they'd never really let you all the way in to begin with. But you didn't leave, you went quiet instead, and those two things are worlds apart from each other. Here's something most people completely miss when they're navigating a relationship with someone avoidant, and once you see it clearly, it changes everything. There are actually two entirely different kinds of silence you can offer an avoidant person. The first kind is silence that still screams underneath. You've gone quiet on the outside, but your behavior, your body language, what mutual friends notice, all of it is broadcasting that you're hurting, that you're waiting for them, that you want nothing more than for them to come back. An avoidant person can sense that particular flavor of silence from a mile away, and honestly, it settles them. It confirms exactly what they already believed, that you need them more than they need you, that they hold the power in this dynamic, that pulling away was the right call because now you're the one chasing the space between you. But there's a second kind of silence entirely. This one has actual weight to it. It's the silence where you stop performing your pain for an invisible audience, where your energy genuinely starts flowing back toward yourself instead of outward toward them, where the waiting doesn't end because you stopped caring, but because you finally stopped handing your emotional piece over to someone who had never once earned that responsibility. That second kind of silence is completely foreign territory to an avoidant person. They don't have a script for it anywhere in their playbook. They've never had to rehearse a response to it, and it triggers something inside them that no amount of pleading, chasing, or emotional pursuit could ever come close to reaching. It goes straight for their attachment wound. Let me walk you through the actual mechanics of what's happening here, psychologically and even neurologically, the moment an avoidant person realizes you're genuinely not going to chase them. Picture a rubber band. An avoidant person has spent their entire life stretching that band, pulling away from closeness, manufacturing distance, and then waiting to feel the other person pull it back toward them. That tension, someone reaching, pursuing, asking for more of them, that tension is actually what makes an avoidant person feel safe. Because as long as you're the one pulling, they hold the control. They get to decide how much closer to let you get, or how much further to stretch you out. They're the ones managing the tension the entire time. But when you go silent, you essentially let go of your end of that rubber band completely. And for a moment, there's nothing there at all, just stillness. And that stillness turns out to be far more unsettling than any argument ever could be. More confronting than any emotional ultimatum you could have delivered, because it isn't pushing against them and it isn't pulling toward them. It's just absence, pure and simple, and an avoidant person's nervous system genuinely has no idea what to do with that kind of nothing. Jung would describe this as a disruption to what he called the persona, the mask a person wears to manage how the world perceives them. For someone avoidant, that persona is built around being the one who doesn't need anybody, the one who's always doing fine, the one who genuinely preferred the space and distance all along. But underneath that carefully maintained mask sits the actual self, the whole human being underneath, who does need connection, who does feel things deeply, who is decidedly not fine. And when your silence takes away the very pressure that had been holding that persona together, the real self underneath starts pushing its way to the surface whether they want it to or not. Now, here's where things get genuinely interesting, because this is the part most psychology content skips right over. An avoidant person doesn't magically transform into the emotionally available partner you always wished they'd been the moment they feel this shift. Don't misunderstand what's happening here. What actually unfolds next is far messier and honestly far more revealing about who they really are underneath everything. Some avoidant people, when confronted with this kind of genuine silence, will reach out. They'll send something casual, something low stakes, testing the waters carefully. A simple, "Hey, how have you been?" as if the weeks of emotional distance never happened, as if there wasn't an entire storm that passed between you both. And if you look closely at a message like that, you'll notice it isn't confidence speaking. That's anxiety dressed up in a calm costume. Other avoidant people respond in the completely opposite direction. They double down on the distance instead. They pull even further away. They tell their friends they're doing great. They might even jump into some new situationship purely to convince themselves they don't actually crave the connection they secretly miss. Jung had a name for this pattern too. He called it projection, taking whatever you can't accept about yourself and pushing it outward, manufacturing external evidence that supports the internal story you're telling yourself. What's fascinating though, and what almost nobody points out, is that both of those responses, the casual check-in and the aggressive retreat, are actually the exact same thing underneath. Both are the avoidant person trying to manage one specific emotion they were never taught how to sit with. Longing. Really sit with that idea for a second. We're generally taught how to handle most difficult emotions growing up. With anger, we're told to count to 10 or step away and cool down. With sadness, we cry it out and eventually move through it. Even fear comes with its own toolkit, breathing techniques, grounding exercises, things to reach for. But longing is different. Nobody ever sits us down and teaches us what to do with it. It's not sharp enough to demand our immediate attention the way panic does. It doesn't shout. It hums quietly in the background of everything you do. And for someone who has spent their whole life constructing an identity around not needing anyone, longing might be the single most threatening emotion that exists. Because longing means wanting something you currently don't have, and wanting something automatically opens up the possibility of losing it. And the possibility of loss is exactly the thing an avoidant person has been sprinting away from their entire life. So when your silence stirs up genuine longing in them, not the familiar tension of pursuit and retreat they know how to manage, but real, aching longing, they end up somewhere they've never navigated before. And here's the honest, unfiltered truth about what that actually means for you. Your silence is genuinely the most powerful move you've ever made in this dynamic. But it only carries that power if it's actually real. And this is where I need you to sit with something that might feel a little uncomfortable to hear. There are really two different reasons people go silent with an avoidant partner. The first is what I'd call strategic silence, where you go quiet as a calculated move, a tactic designed to draw them back in. In that version, you're not actually redirecting your energy anywhere new. You're just playing the exact same game with slightly different pieces on the board. You're still thinking about them constantly. You're still checking whether they viewed your story. You're still fully emotionally entangled in the dynamic, just approaching it from a different angle. The second kind is genuine silence. And this is the version that actually changes your life, no matter what they eventually decide to do with it. This is silence that isn't a strategy at all. It's a consequence. It's what naturally happens when you finally, truly get tired. When it dawns on you that waiting around for someone else to choose you is its own quiet form of abandoning yourself. When you understand, not just intellectually but in your body, that you've been pouring real energy into a space that was never going to pour anything back the same way. Jung wrote extensively about something he called individuation, the ongoing process of becoming a fully integrated, whole version of yourself, not the version shaped entirely by your parents' expectations or your past relationships or the person you had to become just to survive your own childhood, but the actual self underneath all of that, the one that existed before all the adaptations, the armor, and the carefully constructed story you've been telling about who you are. Real silence, the kind that genuinely transforms things, marks the very first step of that individuation process. It's the point where you stop defining your worth in relation to another person and start genuinely asking yourself who you actually are on your own terms. Let me paint an actual picture of what this looks like in real life, because theory without a real story attached is just abstract philosophy floating in the air. Imagine a woman. We'll call her Maya. She'd been caught in an almost relationship with someone for about 8 months. He'd pursue her, she'd open up to him, he'd get close enough to feel real, and then he'd start to vanish again. She'd reach out to close the gap. He'd come back just enough to keep her hooked. It was a textbook anxious avoidant dynamic, and she knew it was. She'd read all the articles. She'd watched the videos on it. She understood the pattern intellectually, inside and out. But she was still living inside of it anyway. Then one night she wrote the long message, the honest one, the one where she finally told him this wasn't working for her anymore and that she needed more than what he was giving. He read it and he responded with something vague, something non-committal, exactly the kind of response designed to keep the door cracked open without ever actually walking through it himself. And something in Maya simply stopped right there. Not because of some strategy she'd picked up online, not because she'd seen a video claiming that going no contact would make him come running back. It stopped because in that exact moment, she understood with total clarity that he had already shown her exactly who he was, and she was the one who kept refusing to believe it. She went quiet, but not dramatically, and not as some kind of announcement. She simply stopped reaching out. She started filling her evenings with other things. She started sleeping better than she had in months. She started having thoughts that weren't circling back to him constantly. 3 weeks later, he sent that same casual, low-stakes text. "Hey, it's been a while. How are things?" And here's the part almost nobody ever talks about. Maya didn't feel triumphant when she read it. She didn't feel the familiar pull she expected to feel rushing back in. What she felt instead was something quieter, something far more solid underneath her. She felt like she was standing on the right side of something important, like she'd passed a test she hadn't even realized she was taking. She responded warmly, kept it brief, and noticed she was genuinely curious about what he'd say next, but the anxiety that used to live underneath that curiosity was simply gone. That shift from anxiety to plain curiosity is not a small thing at all. That's an entirely different relationship with yourself than the one she'd had 8 months earlier. So what actually happened with him? Here's the honest version, not the fairy tale one, because you deserve the real answer, rather than a comforting fiction. He tried reaching out a few more times, got a little more vulnerable in his messages than before, even admitted at one point that he'd been off lately and doing some thinking. This is classic avoidant re-entry behavior, just enough honesty to feel like real progress, without enough actual commitment behind it to be genuine progress. Maya engaged with him from that newly grounded place, clear and warm, never cold or punishing, but also never folding back into the old familiar pattern either. He eventually faded away again because the real work he needed to do was never about Maya in the first place. It was about himself, and he simply wasn't ready to face it yet. But here's what actually made Maya's story transformative. His fading out the second time didn't break her the way it absolutely would have 8 months earlier. Because by the time he faded, she had already started the real work of individuation. She'd already begun becoming someone who wasn't organizing her entire life around his behavior anymore. And that changed everything for her moving forward, not because of anything to do with him, but because of who she had become along the way. Now sometimes, not always, not even usually, but sometimes the story plays out differently. Occasionally, when an avoidant person is confronted with genuine silence that isn't a tactic but a real consequence, they actually do something different. They look inward at themselves honestly. They go into therapy. They open up to someone they trust about the patterns they've been repeating in their relationships. They start recognizing the push and pull for what it really is, the way they manufacture distance and then feel the ache of that absence and don't know what to do with the longing it creates. And sometimes they decide to do the hard thing. They decide to stay and actually face it. Jung described the process of encountering your own shadow not as some gentle, comfortable awakening, but as a real confrontation, one that requires walking directly through whatever you've spent your whole life avoiding. For someone avoidant, that means walking straight through vulnerability, through need, through the genuinely terrifying possibility of loving someone and having them actually stay. When an avoidant person truly does that work, not just the surface level gesture of appearing to change, but the real, uncomfortable, sustained labor of examining why they run in the first place, they can become extraordinary partners. Because they already understand something about emotional depth that most people never even access. They've just spent years running from it instead of toward it. But here's the crucial piece I want you to hold on to. You cannot do that work for them. Your silence was never meant to be a cure. It's a mirror. What they choose to do with their own reflection is entirely up to them, not you. So what does all of this actually mean for you in practical terms? Not philosophically, not as some abstract concept, but right now in whatever situation brought you here today. It means this: the most powerful version of you was never the one who knows how to play the game flawlessly. It's not the version who times every response perfectly, or posts the exact right thing at the exact right moment, or engineers just the right amount of distance to create maximum effect. The most powerful version of you is the one who has genuinely stopped outsourcing their emotional regulation to someone else's behavior entirely. When you reach that place, and you'll recognize it because it feels less like power and more like plain peace, the dynamic with an avoidant person either transforms into something real or it completes and closes on its own. And honestly, both of those outcomes are good ones. Because a relationship that transforms is one where both people finally start showing up honestly with each other. And a relationship that completes means you got yourself back. You got your time back. You got the space to eventually find someone whose nervous system is actually compatible with your own. Someone who doesn't need distance to feel safe. Someone who moves toward you instead of constantly calculating how far away they should stand. The silence you chose was never a weapon aimed at them. It was a return to yourself. And that's precisely what Jung meant when he talked about the most important journey a person can ever take being the one that leads inward. Here's something about avoidant attachment that almost nobody discusses openly enough. Avoidant people aren't heartless, they aren't broken beyond repair, they aren't incapable of love. They're people who learned, usually very early on, often in ways they can't even fully remember consciously, that needing someone wasn't safe. That love came inconsistently. That the people who were supposed to always be there for them weren't always there when it counted, and they built an entire identity around making absolutely sure that particular lesson would never have to be learned twice. When you go silent, genuinely and calmly and peacefully silent, you're not punishing them for any of that. You're simply declining to confirm the same old story they've always told themselves. The story that says everyone eventually becomes too much of a burden, that everyone eventually needs more than can be given, that everyone eventually leaves in the end. Your silence says something entirely different instead. It says, I am not defined by whether or not you choose me. I am not going to perform my worth just to earn your attention. I am not going to shrink myself down so your fear has less to bump into. And that, right there, is honestly one of the most loving things you could possibly do. Not only for yourself, but genuinely for them too. Because it removes the familiar dynamic they've been using to avoid ever having to grow. It puts them in direct contact, maybe for the first time in their life, with the actual consequences of their own pattern. What they choose to do with that contact is their journey to walk, not yours to carry for them. Your journey is this instead: to keep becoming the person who doesn't need an avoidant partner's understanding in order to feel valuable and live fully. To keep choosing every single day the return to yourself over the exhausting performance of neediness. To stop confusing intensity with real intimacy, and to start building toward relationships where safety is simply the baseline expectation, not some rare reward you have to earn. Jung believed that until you make the unconscious fully conscious, it will keep quietly directing your life, and you'll end up calling the results fate. The avoidant person calls their loneliness independence. They call their fear discernment. They call their walls standards. But you, choosing to call yourself back to yourself, that isn't giving up, and it isn't losing anything at all. That is the first fully conscious choice in what might have been a very long pattern of unconscious ones running your life on autopilot. The avoidant person waited for you to beg. You stayed silent instead, and what unfolded wasn't ultimately a love story about them finally coming back to you. It was a love story about you finally coming home to yourself.